Well, for a generation coming of age in the mid-50s, 5 years before the Civil Rights Movement, the death of Emmett Till was a wake-up call for them. Many of those young people ended up being at the vanguard of the Civil Rights Movement. Many of them actually went to college 5-6 years later and became leaders in the sit-in movements. Well, the first legacy, just to reiterate this last point, was that for African Americans and for whites as well, to see images of a 14-year-old boy, all over the world, plastered in the front page of newspapers, in Jet magazine, and other pictorials, it was a wake-up call for them to realize that America has to change, that the South was a very violent place, and that violence had a lot to do with black people struggling for basic citizenship rights. If it wasn't for the images of people like Emmett Till and many others who died in that period of massive violence, I think that many of the folks who volunteered to come south, to participate in voter registration, to participate in desegregation movements, to participate in other civil rights activities, they wouldn't have been as inspired had it not been for Emmett Till. Emmett Till wasn't an activist. He didn't lead a movement. Instead, he was more of a symbol of the legacies of the past and a symbol of the possibilities of a new future if we can eliminate the kind of racial violence. The murder of Emmett Till had a huge emotional impact on the generation of the 1950s, precisely because of the physical disfigurement he experienced, the fact that this was a young boy, 14 years old. I think for a lot of people who might have thought of the South as a very faraway place, or even Southerners themselves who might have thought of the Civil Rights Movement as something that they are not a part of, that this horrible murder or lynching was, a wake-up call. It convinced them that it could be themselves. They saw themselves in his body. And I think that the tears, or maybe the lack of tears in some ways, the anger that people who mourned Emmett Till in Chicago was enough to convince people that things have to change. I think that sometimes we don't pay as much attention to the emotional impact of this movement, precisely because we think of policy, we think of social movements, but we don't think of what it meant to be a black boy in the age of vicious segregationist violence, what it meant to have your life cut short at such a young age for a very small infraction. Now, Mamie Till Bradley's decision to have an open casket funeral was incredibly courageous, and in fact, it was the thing that was even more than his murder, a catalyst for many people to an emotional catalyst for many people who were drawn to this incident, largely because she made a decision to allow the world to see what these white supremacists did to her son. And it became an international event, and that image of his face was marked on just about every single black person, of that generation, let alone people in Europe, in Africa, in Asia who saw the same images. And I know for me personally, when I first saw those images years later, it was shocking to me. It was one of those unforgettable images that I think that every generation, years afterwards, will never forget. When we think of the Emmett Till case, we often think about the big name people like Charles Diggs coming from Michigan, or we think about the NAACP. But, I think the real heroes of that event were people like Mamie Till Bradley, who did make the decision to have an open casket, did make the decision to speak out to the public and to the press about what happened. Mose Wright, who, with the threat of violence, was able to stand up and testify against the white men who lynched Emmett Till. These were, deep down, the real heroes of the Civil Rights Movement, and in some ways really did transform the movement from that point on. Before Emmett Till, much of the civil rights movement was still locked in the courts. You know, you had grassroots organizations struggling. The Montgomery bus boycott was getting underway. But with the lynching of Emmett Till, there was a recognition that one of the most important sites of battle was the right to live. You know, fundamentally, the right to stop the violence directed at black people. This was violence that was escalating because of increasing voter registration drives in Mississippi. 7 or 8 people died in Mississippi that year alone. A lot of them due to the fact that they were trying to register to vote. And so once Mississippians stood up and said, we're not going to take this. We're going to stand up. We're going to defend black people. We're going to stand up, appear in the courthouse, you know, speak to the press. I think that it gave courage to future generations to come forward and say, you know, the violence won't stop this movement. And in fact, the violence is part of what this movement's fighting against, you know. And in that respect, I think it really transformed the nation's civil rights movement. Yeah. I think there's a relationship between the Montgomery bus boycott, the murder of Emmett Till, and Brown versus Board of Education, that these 3 events emboldened black people to stand up in the face of segregation. Emmett Till, in some ways, gave ordinary black people in a place like Montgomery not just courage, but I think, you know, instilled them with a sense of anger, you know, and that anger at white supremacy, and not just white supremacy, but the decision of the court to exonerate these men from murdering, from outright lynching this young kid. That level of anger, I think, you know, led a lot of people to commit themselves to the movement. And in Montgomery felt the reverberations of that, just like Little Rock, Arkansas, you know, 2 years later. And I think that anger was somehow transformed into social movement, and ironically into love, you know. And what I mean by that is into love for the people who they're trying to defend, and love for a nation that had for so long oppressed them, but they felt was transformable. You know, they felt that as black people involved in this movement, that Emmett Till's body was sacrificed in some ways, that George Lee's body was sacrificed, that many of the activists who were murdered were sacrificed for the sake of saving the country, you know, redeeming this nation. And I think that's why you think of something like the nonviolent philosophy of the civil rights movement as directly related to the violence meted out on people like Emmett Till. Mamie Till Bradley's decision to become very active with the NAACP, to speak out, really built up its membership at a crucial moment. I mean, 1955, the NAACP was at war with white supremacists, and in fact, its membership had declined drastically because it had been outlawed in many states. But that kind of national recognition, Mamie Till Bradley's willingness to put herself out there, I think played a key role in building support for the association, and for, you know, again, instilling a sense of courage in those people who were normally just dues-paying members. You know, they went from dues-paying members to active members, from active members to being involved in frontline organizations as a result of, I think, her stance. Mamie Till Bradley is responsible for raising a lot of money for getting the NAACP out of, I think, deep debt. They did invest huge sums of money in Brown versus Board of Education, but that's only part of it. I mean, I think the other part of the story is that they were paying bail. They were, their membership was being destroyed, I mean, through violence. People who were registered to vote were told that if you don't take your names off the rolls, well, you know, you have to leave town, or we'll murder you, or kill your wife or children. These kinds of threats really led to the shrinking of the NAACP's base. And without that base, you lose your dues-paying membership. So it was a very difficult time for the NAACP, and that's why, ironically, the Emmett Till case was a kind of shot in the arm in a very tragic way. Had it not been for that kind of financial support, the NAACP might not have survived, into the early 60s, at a crucial moment when the civil rights movement was just taking off. When Emmett Till was lynched in 1955, there hadn't been a lynching in about 2 years. Mississippi and other southern states of the Deep South were trying to become legitimate, legal, presentable states. Soon after Brown versus Board of Education, you see the development of the White Citizens Councils. White Citizens Councils were supposed to be like Rotary clubs of white supremacy. They were to be legitimate. They said they don't use violence. They don't use intimidation. They use legal methods. And we know that's not true, but this was the front that white supremacists in Mississippi put up. For Mississippi to legitimize itself, it had to have a trial. It had to at least show a front of justice. Otherwise, it could be easily dismissed by the federal government. And all of its claims for the right to be autonomous, to have states' rights, to take care of its own affairs, would have been null and void. The other thing is that in the age of the Cold War, states like Mississippi and Alabama were looked upon by the world. The United States had a foreign policy of proving that democracy exists at home, proving that it doesn't have a race problem or a colonial problem. And it became more and more difficult for the State Department to do its work outside of the United States when back home you have all this racism and violence. And so there was pressure on Mississippi from the State Department, pressure on Mississippi from the federal government, pressure on Mississippi congressmen, senators, and the governor to look legitimate. So they tried to strike this balance between legality and legitimacy on the one hand, and the same old white supremacy and violence on the other. And so the trial was somewhat of a show, though everyone knew what the outcome would be, and that is not guilty. The level of violence that was commonplace in a place like Mississippi became known to the world. And that violence generated anger and outrage and in some ways courage for those fighting in Mississippi and those willing to come south to fight that fight. Jim Crow and racism as it used to exist from the age of slavery can no longer exist. Something has to change. And black people in Mississippi itself were the ones who were going to make that change. And the great thing is that the change that they made, the extension of citizenship to all people, is a change that affected all of America, not just black people, but whites, Latinos, Asian Americans. It extended democracy to the country when democracy had never been extended to everyone before. I think that for some white Americans who were not aware of the kind of viciousness that was part of the culture in the Deep South, seeing those images on the front page of newspapers, in Jet magazine, wherever they saw it, it was striking for them. And I think that it convinced some white Americans to actually participate in the movement. It convinced others to give money. And it still convinced others that, America is not what they thought it would be. It's not an accident that 10 years later you have this emergence of a counterculture where a lot of whites, not just young people, but whites across ages, began to be concerned about race relations in America. I think that for white Mississippians, Emmett Till did a couple things. For those who thought that that violence can continue as it always has been, realized that all eyes of the federal government, all eyes of the world were on them. And so they had to be more careful. You begin to get pressure from some white supremacists against using violence in the late 50s and early 60s. You see this in Alabama. You see this in Georgia. An attempt to, again, become legitimate. But the impossible thing is that you cannot maintain white supremacy and Jim Crow without violence. It wasn't possible, you know. And that's why ultimately the whole system had to collapse. The federal government did not become involved in the Till case, like they didn't become involved in many, many cases of violence during the Civil Rights era. One, because the federal government really had close ties to Southern Democrats. Their political purposes, political reasons for not intervening. Two, many federal agents and J. Edgar Hoover and others believed that the Civil Rights Movement was communist inspired and had been pushing that for a long time. And so for them, they treated the movement for social justice as the enemy, as opposed to being a friend. And of course, this had a huge impact on the movement itself, because many activists believed they could not rely on the federal government for support. Emmett Till's image is invoked today in so many cases of police violence. You know, you think about Michael Stewart or someone like Amadou Diallo, the big cases that we're familiar with. I know activists oftentimes will speak of Emmett Till, although it wasn't a case of police violence. It was certainly a case where a murder took place and the state turned the other, sort of looked the other way, did not intervene, did not protect the rights of the individuals. And so many victims of today's police violence are young people, you know, young people like Emmett Till, young people whose crime was oftentimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, you have cases of modern day lynchings like Howard Beach. You know, these cases of urban violence, these contemporary violence cases, the last 20 years, all harken back to the legacy of Emmett Till. The difference is, and maybe it's not a difference, but one difference is that Emmett Till inspired generations of people to fight for social justice, to say we're going to put an end to this. This level of violence will never take place again. The question is whether or not future generations, in fighting against police violence, in fighting against racial violence, will also be inspired to put an end to it once and for all. And that's the fundamental question. The Emmett Till case was a spark for a new generation to commit their lives to social change. You know, they said, we're not going to die like this. Instead, we're going to live and transform the South so people won't have to die like this. And if anything, if any event of the 1950s inspired young people to be committed to that kind of change, it was the lynching of Emmett Till. We often think of Emmett Till as a case of a young man being murdered, but we don't always pay attention to what it meant for a young woman, a young mother, to stand up and really commit her life to activism, to social change. The courage that she exhibited, I think, was a role model for many of the women who were drawn to the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, you know, we often talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, we talk about Ella Baker. We don't always talk about Mamie Till Bradley as one of those heroines who stood up at a time when not many women were being called forth in the struggle to that degree.